So again, as a reminder, if you look down below the video, we had in the description, it's got the an index and the times, and there's a link out to our uh, big index where I've got like 3 years of these meetings documented, so you can get a link to that. Oh, one other thing I just noticed that if I those are on my website, which is not a secure website, so the link says HTTP colon. And if you click on that, somebody, and I don't know if it's YouTube or somebody else, puts HTTPS in there. So then your browser comes up and says, oh, that's an insecure site. You're possibly somebody's trying to screw you because you're trying to go to a secure site and it's not secure. And the thing is, if you just delete the S off and reload it, then my stuff will come up. So, and they might just be doing that to force everybody to go to secure web pages and pay the extra money to whoever issues certificates. So anyway, so anyway, on that you can click on the link and go to the HTML index of our meetings, and then we've also got the page, a link to go back to the YouTube page where it's got all the videos. So you put all that stuff together, you can kind of figure out how to get into this stuff. So over the past couple months, people decided they're going to switch from ROS1 to ROS2, and Al decided he wanted to get rid of his laptop and go to a Raspberry Pi just so it was smaller and easier to power it and so forth. And so in the process of that, well, I don't want to get left behind, so I thought I'd pull up my Raspberry Pi 4 and load up Ubuntu 2404 and ROS Jazzy on the thing, and I was able to do that. It seems to run. But going through that whole process, you run into the case that there seems to be a problem in this whole world where, depending what board, especially the little computer boards, there's an issue on what will run on the board and what will not. So, like for instance, the new Raspberry Pi has to have either Ubuntu 23 something or 2404 is the only thing that'll run on that board. Well, it turns out the Pi 4 will also run 2404. And I'm guessing if you go back to a Pi 3, it will not run those things. So you got this issue of you have to match your hardware to an operating system that you want to run. And then on the other side, you have the fact that ROS has tied theirself to Ubuntu releases. So usually it gets to the point now, they'll say, if you want to run ROS Jazzy, you have to have Ubuntu 2404. If you want to run Humble, which is the next supported release behind that, if you want to run that one, you have to run 2204. And if you want to back up to Foxy, which is no longer supported, well, I don't know if it's supported or not, but it's not the one they're recommending. That one, it says you have to have Ubuntu 2004. So they got those tied together. So now you gotta get those to match, and then you have to make sure that operating system will run on the particular board you have. So that gets to be a problem. And then you have the problem where the Jetson Nano came out. It seemed like a really cute little board, and so the people at NVIDIA took one of the standard Ubuntu releases. I think it was 1604 at the time, and they took that and they hacked it so it would work with the Jetson Nano, and then they called it Jetpack or something like that. And then you could just load that on the board, and it would give you Ubuntu Linux, but it had all the extensions to talk. I don't know if it's talk to their chip or what the thing was. And then they upgraded it to when they came out with 1804. I think they upgraded and called it like Jetpack 2 or something. And then somewhere they made an announcement, we're not going to upgrade this anymore. So now you bought this board. I think it was $99 a time. You bought the board, and after a couple of releases, it says, well, we're not gonna deal with this anymore. And it could be maybe you could just load straight Ubuntu onto that board and not have to use their Jetpack nonsense. I've never looked into that. And then other people say, oh, well, it's possible to put a Docker image, or they put Docker support onto your Jetson Nano, and they create a Docker container and load up whatever you want on it. And theoretically, I would think you could go all the way up to the Ubuntu 2404 and the ROS Jazzy and put it on that, and then run that Docker image under your board. And then theoretically, you can do everything you need to do. So the question becomes, how much extra overhead does putting something in a Docker container add to what you're trying to do? And I don't know the answer to that. And then so I'm back to the thing, I can't think what they call it. You can also get the thing where you put like the virtual machine on your computer. And back to the Docker thing. Once you got that Docker image with the Ubuntu 2404 and ROS Jazzy, technically, I think you can take that Docker container and run that under Windows if you want to. So there's, you got more options there of what you can do. But I ran across one guy saying, well, yes, but he tried to do that. He tried to run that under, I think it was on a Raspberry Pi, and seemed to think that it slowed things down enough that it wasn't going to be usable. So that's another issue you got there. So I was thinking about, it'd be nice if somebody had a web page where they said I compared something like VirtualBox or one of those type of programs, compared that to a Docker implementation, and says, which one slows it down more, which one is totally usable, and that kind of stuff. So if anybody runs across that kind of comparison, I at least would like to know that. So what was the other thing on that? So now you got the problem. As I was telling Al just earlier here, I have a laptop. It's like a HP, it was a Pavilion, or no, it's an HP ProBook, I think is what it's called. Because the one in front of me is a Pavilion, and that's not the one. So anyway, it's got like a Intel i7 processor, and it currently has Ubuntu 2004 loaded on it. And when I first started playing, I thought, okay, I looked and I could load ROS1 Noetic, which is that's the last version of ROS1 they came out with. That's loaded on it. And then to go with that, I loaded ROS2 Foxy, which I think at the time was either the current one or it's hadn't been dropped off support at that point. And so I can go onto that computer and I can either run ROS1 stuff, or I can run ROS2 stuff. Or what you can do back in the day, they have something called ROS1 Bridge, and you fire that up, and what it does, it converts ROS1 messages into ROS2 messages. So now you can fire up ROS1 and ROS2 on that same computer, and they will transparently talk back and forth. There might be some limits to that, but in general, they talk back and forth. So I was thinking you could fire up ROS1 and plug in all your sensors to it, and your interface to your little microcontroller board. And because the problem is, as they keep advancing, they keep dropping support off for sensors too. So if you got an old sensor, you may not be able to find any drivers for ROS2 period. And then you'd have to go, if you wanted to, you could go back to the ROS1 source code and manipulate it so it'll run under ROS2. And I assume that you have to change all the networking stuff and how it registers itself, and probably some other things. So you might be able to actually move that into ROS2, whatever the latest version is. But I was thinking, instead of doing that, if you had the ROS1 running and just plug your stuff in you got now, that possibly that would all work. And then if you want the new fancy stuff from ROS2, you can fire up the ROS2 copy. Say if you want to run ROS2 navigation or navigation 2 or whatever they call that. So you could run the high powered stuff under ROS2, and then ROS1 is still dealing with all your sensors. And I suppose you could run the ROS or the logging and do what's it called, ROS bag record. You could run that on that one. So that's some things I thought of there. And I'm thinking, but you can only upgrade that so far, because now you're locked into that operating system of 2004. And then ROS2 says, oh, I have to have this version of operating system run. So you can't just drop it on there and run it. And I had another thought. What if you just had a separate computer that's going to run ROS1? So it's like, let's say I take one of my old Raspberry Pi 3 boards and load on whatever appropriate operating system I need, and then load on, say, ROS Noetic, and they just have that board. That board's just going to be essentially, that would be on your vehicle, tied to all your sensors. And then you could either run an Ethernet cable or Wi-Fi or whatever and hook it up to another computer. And there you could have a separate computer that's going to be running a modern version of Ubuntu and a modern version of ROS2. And then I don't know if those two will talk back and forth, or there's going to be an interface version issue. It could be that they won't talk to each other because of something. I haven't gone down that path, and I haven't looked for anybody trying to do this stuff. But that might be another option. You end up with another whole computer in the mix, but it seems like you could probably get that to work. And I was trying to think what else. So So back to the issue of the Raspberry Pi. I don't know what it takes to modify an operating system for a new board, but I've noticed all along in the Raspberry Pi stuff, the board will come out. Usually they wouldn't even announce they're coming out with a new board, but all of a sudden it says, oh, you can now buy a Pi 3 today, or you can buy a Pi 4 today. And then if you're lucky, they will say, now here's the updated Raspberry Pi operating system. So as soon as you buy the board, you can load that and play with it. And then I think it's either on the 4, maybe on the 4, they started selling the board, and even that wasn't upgraded to the point where it would run. So you had to wait like a couple of months, and then you could load the Raspberry Pi operating system and prove your board works and play with it. And then you had to wait for, like 6 months before Ubuntu would catch up to come out with a release for that. Now, I believe on the Raspberry Pi 5, I think they actually announced that one ahead of time. And they announced it ahead of time, and I don't know if that gave people time to catch up on that. But I know Bob bought one of those and found out you couldn't get anything to load on it. And I think he just put it on the shelf, and it probably sat there for 6 months or whatever. And then I think finally Al bought one to build his NAS drive system. And I'm guessing at that point it had caught up and you could do modern stuff with it. But the point is, I don't know why it's so hard to get that to work, because you can grab a laptop and it seems like you can put like any version of Ubuntu on a laptop that you want. But for some reason on these ARM boards, I don't know if it's the fact that it's ARM software, or it's the weird peripherals in it or something. But it just seems like that's yet another issue there. So before you go to do the stuff, you need to track all this stuff down and say, if I get this board, can I run this operating system, this version of software? And if not, then where do you go from there? So that I've been thinking about that, because a guy from Boston wrote to me and said, I was trying to do this, and he just kept buying newer stuff, and he finally he started with a iCreate robot that he'd bought, like just the chassis part of it, and you could buy those for like $100 for like refurbished. And he put either a Raspberry Pi of some sort or a Jetson Nano on that, and he got to the point where it was running, but it says the dog kept attacking it and trying to destroy it. So he put it back on the shelf, and I went back to look at this stuff again, and he said, well, he could either run his Jetson Nano, but he found out it's not supported anymore. You can't just automatically load it up and run. And he said, well, maybe if you're tricky, you could get it to run 2004. And that, I think that was based on all this Docker stuff that everybody says you could do. That is where he came up with that. So he said, well, instead of doing that, he ran out and bought a Raspberry Pi 5, and then he's telling me, issues about why that's a problem. And one of the first problems he had was he had one of those XV11 LiDAR units that looks like this. Here, let me do this. I keep forgetting to do this. I was trying to blame on the fact I switched from Windows to Linux, but no, that's not the case. So anyway, he's got one of these that's just a little spinny thing, and it's like the RP LiDAR and all that kind of stuff. And this particular one has a little board the guy from Dallas Robotics made that has two connectors that plug into the LiDAR, and then coming off the other side just got a USB cable. In this case, I've got a Raspberry Pi on here. So the Raspberry Pi actually provides power to this thing, and then that spins your motor, so it controls the speed of the motor. And then a serial interface that comes back. It basically just translates that into something that the USB can handle. And speaking of that, this is the first vehicle I built with ROS. The first with the Raspberry Pi with ROS. This happens to be a Pi 2. And when the Pi 2 came out, I think that's the first one you could run Ubuntu on. And since ROS always says, oh, you must run Ubuntu, or we're not going to support it or whatever. So that's the first one I had. I was able to get some version of Ubuntu to run on that, and I just built everything up from that. So anyway, he had one of those, and he said he couldn't find a ROS2 driver for that particular laser. So he went out and bought a was it Hoyoko or whatever. I'm assuming those are fairly expensive. But he said he got that one, and it's probably a much better unit in the first place, which I'm sure it is. And he said he couldn't get something to compile on that. So there's the issue you have. The other thing is, not only can you not use your old boards, now you can't use your old peripherals because they keep dropping support for your peripherals. So as this stuff moves on, you just have to decide, do I want to stay with state of the art, or do I want to just back up and you got the option, you can back up to an old version of ROS, old version of operating system, and keep all your old stuff and just move on with it. And the other option is you want state of the art stuff. Well, now you have to go out and buy the fancy laser scanners, the fancy cameras, and all the old stuff you have probably is not going to work anymore. Now, you've always got some way to merge this stuff together. That's why I was suggesting having just a, say, like a Raspberry Pi 3 running ROS1, just to hook all your old sensors up to it. Because if you had them working on that, they're still going to work. And if you can get the messages from that over to ROS2, then that would possibly fix your problems, but I'm not sure. Yeah, any day they're going to change the way the whole interface works, and nothing's going to work anymore. So that's just more issues to think about. And it'd be nice if someone made just a big chart somewhere and publish on the internet that says, here's boards that'll work with these, and these versions of operating systems work on those boards, and these versions of ROS run on these operating systems. And if you had some way you could keep track of this stuff. I did notice, what was it? It was so I was looking up this ROS1 bridge, and I thought, well, will it talk to a different version of operating or a different version of ROS? And because it wants to, at the time, it wanted to talk to ROS Foxy, based on the operating system level. And then I was looking, and I found GitHubs where people were saying try to get ROS1 bridge to talk to ROS Humble, which is that's the next supported version up. And so people are specifically at least looking at that, or maybe they wrote code to do that. And then the question is, well, will it talk to ROS Jazzy? I was hoping you could just plug it in and it would talk to those, but I haven't done those experiments. I'm just thinking if somebody has a whole web page on doing it for Humble, maybe it's more effort than I think it is to make that work. So anyway, that's just the whole um, version hell that's out there, that you have to get this you have to get the stuff that merges or works well together. And there's so many different levels of stuff now. You got the hardware, and you got so you can have your little microcontroller board that does all the low level stuff, and it's got to be able to talk to your ROS machine. And again, that might be a ROS1 or ROS2 that's running on that. And then you got sensors that can plug right into that, whether they be cameras or um, lidars or whatever. Sometimes you could, and maybe even IMU might plug right into a USB port. And then if not, you might have down at the low level in microcontroller, you can plug in an IMU down there and just use whatever the microcontroller interface is. And then you can pass these messages back up and down the chain. So that's something I've been thinking about here in the last week, even though I don't have time to think about anything right now. This keeps popping into my head. I was thinking about that kind of stuff. And um, maybe that's all I have to say on that. Al, do you have any questions on all that stuff I just brought up?
Well, I don't know. It's not a question, but I do. I love the term version hell. Um, Micro ROS is one of those things that I think triggers version hell. Because as you know, we've been both not struggling, but exploring or understanding how to get that to work. And I'm, yeah, you're absolutely right. I tried to switch to Raspberry Pi 5, and I don't think I've gotten there completely yet, but was triggered by trying to lower, or I needed to integrate power into either the Raspberry Pi or my laptop, and I decided to try to do that on the Raspberry Pi for size and amperage use needs. But yeah, version hell is definitely where I'm at.
So that brings up a couple questions before you move on there. Uh, have you tried your Raspberry Pi on a battery yet to know if, yeah, because we decided you probably have to do some extra configuration. I just wonder if you've played with that.
No, I bought the power unit that both you and Bob mentioned. I don't know if I have a picture of it here handy. If I go to but I haven't actually tried it yet.
It turns out the Pi 4 doesn't care. If you give it power, it'll run. But then the Pi 5, they added that new thing, says it checks to see if you it interrogates the power supply. It says, are you 5 amps? And if not, then it limits you in a couple of ways. But somebody said if you go into the configuration and type this in, that says just ignore all that and go ahead and run. So I just curious if you've tried any of that and if that will indeed work.
Um, I'm just trying to pull up my Miro board and see if I've got that on my On my board, I do. So it's this DROK buck converter, 12 volt to 5 volt. So I've got it spec'd, I've got it purchased, but no, I haven't tried to jam in some power into it and see if my RPi 5 yet will play nicely with that unit.
Were you also going to go down the path of just taking a USB cable and hook it up to this power supply and then plug it into the proper place on the Raspberry Pi? But that's what I have done, and it looks like that's what Bob did also. He's got a slightly different power supply, but he's got that cable. It was like
Yeah, I think I followed either yours or Bob's lead on that and got that same cable that supposedly would handle whatever it was, 17 watts or something.
yeah,
Or no, it was the gauge of the wire that I think was it 17 gauge wire? Doesn't matter,
18,
but
it,
yeah, something like that.
something like that, yeah. So that's something I'll be curious, once you hook that up, does it? Because it said somewhere if you do a D message, a message will pop up and say, "Oh, I can't find your power supply. I'm going to limit your USB ports," and that'd be one of the indications. And then it also says you can't boot from the USB port if it detects you don't have a 5 amp supply. So I'm hoping that just changing the one statements, you have to go in somewhere in a configuration. You have to say USB max power. You have to say equals 1, and that says uh, we're going to ignore the thing that we put in to check for that. So that's just something down the line to figure out if that's going to work or not.
And then just for posterity's sakes and voice to text translation, if you make it to the homebrew robotics meeting next week, I'll go with you.
Well, I'll probably keep that in mind. I've got a calendar program set up. So on Tuesday, it sends me a message early in the morning saying there's a meeting tonight and a link out to their email. Hey, or what do you call it? The chat page, yeah, the message board. And because even though it's supposed to be every Tuesday at that time, you have to go out there and say, "Oh, well, we're going to cancel it because we're busy or something." So it's always good to check. And the other thing was, for a while, they would change the Zoom link at least every week or every once in a while they would change that. So I just have a thing that sends me a reminder early in the morning and says, "Oh, go out to the Homebrew Robotics webpage, and there you can verify if they're having the meeting. And when you go to start the meeting, you can click on their link." So, because I originally I was just sending myself the link directly, but then I found out, oh, it doesn't work anymore. So that just makes it easier. And then my
What's that
calendar
software?
program, I was just using just whatever the calendar and Yahoo or something, Yahoo Mail, and I just simply said at this time send this message, and then later in the day, like 15 minutes before it starts, I just have it send to me that again, so that way you don't completely forget. It'll pop up and you can see what's going on there. But that was the
So
key. The text would just simply say go out to their webpage and look, and that way that verifies they're going to have it, and then gives you the actual link to sign in.
Yahoo Calendar can send you a text.
It's not a text; it's an email. They send me emails, and you might be able to
Hmm,
send a text also, but I generally go with emails,
interesting.
and probably any calendar program has those kind of uh, fancy features if you just poke at it hard enough.
So were you done?
Oh, I also wanted to ask. You're talking about you say you're moving to a Raspberry Pi 5 and ROS Jazzy, and you're working out details. What have you found as far as can you find drivers that will work with that will match your old sensors or whatever that you have? Is that how's that journey going?
Well, the I haven't completed it. The next one to sort of resolve is the GPS, and how to get the GPS signal in and parsed, and because ROS1 was, I forgot, NavSat, that was the name of the package or something. So I'm not sure what the ROS2 package is for doing all of that. My assumption is it's a fairly straightforward process, but no, I haven't completed that. And I was trying to work out feeding the ODOM data from the wheel sensors into something, and I think I'll do that into the Teensy 4.1. And then if I want to, the GPS units can take a wheel ODOM, but they don't take a left and right. They just take either a tick or a speed data, but you've got to combine the left and right together, it appears to me. So still more, as you call it, version hell and integration stuff to work through, trying to move up to ROS2.
Yeah, I just wondered as you go down the line, it's like you've already stuff on your existing machine running under ROS1. And I just wondered, because the trick is going to be go down the line for every device you have to have a driver for it. So you go out and you say, on ROS2, can I get a driver to talk to this device? And if you can't, then you have to decide what to do. Either, try to look for somebody else that's created a driver on their own, or you have to get the source code and modify it to be a ROS2 node. And I haven't looked at that at all, so I don't know how much screwing around that is. Or you can just simply throw the device away and put it on a different one that they now support. That's another way to do it. That's going to get old real quick. And I'm sure everybody has a whole box of stuff they bought and not using for one reason or another, and it just gets to be a certain age and nobody supports it anymore. And so you just have to decide what to do about that as you get that far, I guess.
In my ROS1 world, so I had the ROS was up here running on the laptop, and as far as integration goes, most of the integration was going in on this ESP32. So as far as sensors go, I had the left speed and right speed. Yeah, I think the only one for me at this moment using the Raspberry Pi, now that I've concluded that I'm not going to try to make micro ROS work, is dealing with the GPS, because I'll feed. So like I've got a couple of different IMUs, and I'm thinking, well, am I going to put that into ROS? Am I going to feed that in? Probably. No, that's, I guess, one that I'll have to integrate too, is how to get this B&O85 data into ROS, whether I do that through the Teensy or directly into the RPi. I'll probably do that directly through the RPi. So GPS and the IMU data, I guess, would be what got to still resolve. And sadly, not using micro ROS because I don't have a PhD in compilers. Trying to figure that out. Anyway, that's what's going on in my world. But speaking of GPSs, I did put in an order for this uBlocks M9 DR, and the reason I went with that is because it does have the dead reckoning reference, and I'm again to try to future-proof this GPS purchase to get dead reckoning data into this. So that's the next. That's a step up for me, actually, a step sideways. I had a 4 year ago purchase of really expensive GPS to get RTK, but then now it's probably 1/8 the cost to get these. But we'll see how that goes.
And if you go to mount stuff, keep in mind might want to mount this and then mount your old GPS on there also, your RTK GPS. Don't throw it out completely, because if you decide you need to run them both or you need to switch back and forth, they'll be right there, still bolted on your machine. You can get to them.
You're right. That's a good point, because the notion of having a constant heading, GPS derived heading data, I think would be useful and interesting. Maybe to feed that into the RPI or somewhere to calculate what's the constant heading, even if it's not moving.
And also, if your RTK is giving you a heading, possibly you have to be moving to get that, but you can compare that against your dead reckoning heading and see, make sure it hasn't drifted off or it's not doing something stupid to you. But just, another background thing you could do is, compare these things back and forth just to tell you, oh, something's wrong here. So that might be good.
Yeah, well
So as
said.
far as the uBlock stuff, they do have officially supported drivers for ROS1 and ROS2 for uBlocks. And that's what I use on my stuff. And I'm able to pull out the that weird what do they call that? The static heading. There's something, the moving baseline message that gives me the static heading. Somehow I'm able to pull that out of their driver. So there's one that says DR. You'd have to look to see if that's going to be supported, or it could be it's going to put out certain messages that you need to know, and then go look through the driver to see if it supports those messages and will publish it. It could be it just, whatever comes in, you can get it to publish anything you want, but then you may have to parse that out to figure out, what you want out of that. So it's just
Nice.
more things to think about there. Maybe think about that ahead of time before you, so that way, so ahead of time that, what direction you have to go, instead of saying, oh, I got this now, what do I do now? So that,
Yeah, I would definitely rather use their parser versus having to build my own. That would be really bad. The only other thing I've been messing around with is it's only tangentially related to robotics, and that's on the hope that maybe someday I get some vision related thing going on with the camera. But I have hooked up a old Microsoft webcam 1080p probably resolution to a Raspberry Pi 4 and loaded OpenCV vision software on it. And the notion is to have I'm just calling it a pump monitor, to look on the outside of my deep well pump house. I have a 60-watt bulb that comes on. The electrician, it's a 220-volt pump, but the electrician hooked up one 60-watt bulb on half of the circuit that comes on whenever the pump is on. And the notion is, I don't want that pump running if there's a leak or something that the cows might have done. I don't want that pump running constantly, because it's 180 feet under the ground, and replacing it would be a big drama. So I've been messing around with OpenCV and creating a pump monitor. The logic at the moment is based on brightness level, and it's meant to have a threshold, and if the, the brightness changes by a certain amount, to say, hey, this is a pump event. And in the nighttime, that's perfectly easy because it goes from dark to bright, but in the middle of the day, it's I'm getting false positives. So I'm trying to work through how to eliminate false positives. And before you give me, rightfully so, 6 other ways I could trigger a pump event, like hooking up something to the electricity to say, hey, if it's drawing watts, I could even monitor the number of amps that the pump is drawing. I was doing this largely just to test, messing around with OpenCV and a camera, and with the potential hope of someday in the robotics world using a camera to do something like visual odometry, effectively using video to localize the robot. But anyway, it's been interesting. Times suck is what I would call this at the moment. It's nothing like spending a lot of time just to get noisy data, which is effectively where I'm at the moment.
yeah, some of those inevitable suggestions is just a regular light bulb you screw in there. You know,
It is. I mean, it's an outdoor rated 60-watt bulb-ish. It's
because
probably an LED bulb, but
you might consider if you could buy a different color light bulb and put in there, if that would help out your recognition. So you can say, oh, it's green. You know, they might show up differently in the sun depending on what kind of bulb you put in there. So that's something else you might think of. Or you could probably buy a light bulb that blinks, and that way your software would look for something that's on and then off and on and off. That might be another way to, you know, to determine if, you know, get rid of some of the noise, just get around it. That's just a couple things that came to mind as you were saying that.
yeah, I think the earlier unrecorded suggestion of hooking something up directly in the pump house and getting another either LoRa or Wi-Fi signal from an ESP32 or something like that. That's going to be, I don't know what the right term is. The data will be more refined, or the data will be cleaner. So, and yes, I'll put temperature on that too, and I can trigger a heater and
Monitor gallons per minute.
try to control the rotation of the Earth from there. That's it for me. I need to get back out and try to mount my linear actuator to my hydrostatic transmission. That's really what would be the most value added at the moment.
So as far as your hydrostatic, is there any way you can, hey, if you determine, if you put that linear actuator, how quickly you can change the speed up and down? You know,
No, I
one
haven't.
way to do it, just lay the actuator down, so go from this position to this position and time it, see how long it takes. And then consider if you're, if you start at a dead stop and you say, I want to go forward at 1 meter per second, it's going to move it a certain distance ahead. You know, figure out, you know, just by watching the actuator, you can tell how long it's going to take. You know, is it going to take half a second or 1 second or 3 seconds to do that? And
Right.
then more importantly, as you're driving along at full speed and you want to stop, you don't want to take 3 or 4 seconds for the thing to slow down, because you can go a long distance in that amount of time. So I was just wondering, before you get it all mounted, if there's some way you can tell, um, make an estimate of how well that's going to work out for you.
I have to run some tests.
And I don't
Hey,
remember which actuator you got, as far as, you know, they'll rate them in what, inches per second or something, or whatever they're rated in. And you can ones that are fairly fast, ones that are fairly slow. And, you know, depending on which one you bought, that's going to affect that also.
hey, you can either pause or stop recording. I need to take a call from my son
Okay, I think
real
we're done.
quick.